right, here it is. All right, we'll wait. We'll give it about 30 seconds to allow viewers to connect before we get. All right, so we'll get started. Good evening to our viewers, and thank you for joining this discussion. And before I get into today's discussion, this is the first town hall since we have finally resolved our elections crisis of May 2nd, 2020, and have a duly elected government in place. Indeed, that was a historic battle and victory for democracy and all Guyanese. And in the words of the newly minted president, Dr. Ali, it is time to build the Guyana that we all want to see. It is in that spirit, our discussion, the topic of our discussion tonight is on public budgeting and the national budget. The national budget is the most important economic and fiscal policy tools available to the government. It is used to achieve many goals, including reducing poverty, creating jobs, growing an economy, driving private sector investment, and more importantly, to create a foundation for long-term economic prosperity. Something that is this important clearly requires us as citizens to have a good understanding of the budgeting process and the budget itself. This understanding is important because it helps us to get engaged with the process and to understand what makes for a good budget, and also to help us as citizens to monitor budget spendings. To help us get through all of this, I am honored to have with me three distinguished panelists tonight. First, I have Mr. Ramesh Prasad, which is no stranger to many of you, very experienced professional in the business and finance field, who is probably one of the most thorough understanding of the budget process in Guyana. In fact, I would make a disclosure to say much of my interest in the national budget started years ago from reading articles that Ramesh wrote in the papers and assessing the budget. I have with me also Mr. Joseph Panisi, our guest from the US, who has held very senior positions in government in the New York State and in the Albany County in New York, and who has had a lot to do with budgeting, the process and budgeting itself. And we have also Richard Rambarran, who is a trained economist, a development economist, who also have experience in budget preparation and analysis. And so we're going to look to these three gentlemen this evening to enlighten us and give us some answers to the questions that we have. Gentlemen, a pleasant good evening to all of you, and thank you all for agreeing to participate in this discussion.
Good evening to you too.
Good evening.
I would like to start first with Joseph. Joseph, to kick this discussion off, help our viewers understand, first of all, what is public budgeting, why it is important, and why should we care? First of all, why should we care about this?
I think that's a great way to start off, to make sure that your viewers understand the aspects of public budgeting, what it means, and as you say, why it's important and why they need to care. So I think we should start just by looking at the word budget and the meaning of the budget. Budget serves both as a verb and as a noun. As a verb, budget means a process. It's balancing the revenues and spending needs of a government. It involves the development, passage, monitoring, and amendment of a fiscal plan throughout a given fiscal year. Okay? Another meaning of budget, or another way of looking at budget, is as a fiscal plan, a financial plan. It's a financial plan for the government that it lays out the expected spending and revenue activities for the fiscal year. Now, this requires that the spending that makes up the budget not exceed the estimated available revenues to support that spending. Although certainly in the case of national governments, there's the possibility of going beyond the available revenues and doing deficit spending. And as a quote that sort of sums up the budget as a financial plan comes from our former president, George W. Bush, who said it's clearly a budget. It's got a lot of numbers in it, right? So to one extent or another, the budget's about the numbers, but it's about much more than that. A budget is an operational blueprint. It can be defined as a dollars and cents expression of a plan of action that determines what is to be accomplished in the coming year by a government. And it authorizes the financial resources that are necessary to support those activities. Budget's a political document, right? Do you ever notice how much attention the budget gets in an election year? A lot of reasons for that. Officials up for re-election often utilize the budget as a statement of their achievements and the political promises for their upcoming term. But most importantly, and this gets to the question of why is it important and why should people care? A budget is a statement of priorities. It's much more than the numbers that comprise it. Each of those numbers in a budget document on both the revenue and spending sides of the ledger reflect choices with respect to who gets benefits from the government and who pays for those benefits. Just a couple more quotes for you in that regard. This is from Jack Lew, the former Treasury Secretary here in the United States. He writes, "The budget is not just a collection of numbers, but an expression of our values and aspirations," right? Much more than the numbers. It's a policy document. It really explains the priorities of the government. And the final quote is from former Vice President Joe Biden, who says, "Don't tell me what your priorities as a government are. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what your priorities are," right? So the budget document really incorporates implicitly or explicitly the priorities of the government that creates it. And I lied, one final menu in this, or one final quote, and this again gets to the question of why it's important and why people should care. If you're not at the table, you're likely to be on the menu, right? If you're not involved in the budget process, you can be pretty much sure that your interests will not be, not only not be honored, but you may end up paying for things that you end up not wanting to have. So that really gets to the question of, what is a budget? Why is it important? And why should people care? And importantly, why should they participate in the budgeting process?
And thanks for that, Joseph. I think that was an excellent response. And I like the way you end that, which gives me a good segue into the next question that I have, which is for Ramesh. Clearly, what Joseph is saying, the budget is not just about numbers that you're going to throw inside there and allocate to agency. It is a reflection of your priorities. It's a statement about your values. And clearly, as he said, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. So people naturally needs to be part of this process. But you can't be part of something if you don't understand the process. So I'm going to throw a tall order on you today and ask you to give us an understanding in a very layman terms, as simple as you can, explain the public budgeting process in Guyana, where it starts, who are the players, how the public participates, what is part of the package, up until the point where we say Parliament's approved the budget. The Parliament approved the budget. Walk us through that first.
Well, I could take several weeks to explain that, right? But I'll try my best to put that in a nutshell. From following off from what Joseph just spoke about, the budget is often seen as a financial tool done by finance people and so forth. I would just like to say that the budget is a whole lot more than numbers. It is a tool for communication. It's a tool for coordination. It is a tool of planning. It's a tool for negotiation and so forth. And the process of preparing the budget is much more important than the actual budget itself, because you go through a journey, all right? I like to see that, budgets prepared by government, we elect government to take care of the people. We elect government to advance our development. We elect government for our own development as individual, development of society, keep order, and so forth. It therefore means that government have to take us on a journey, either forward or backward in some cases, but we elect government to take us forward. And I often like to see the budget is the road by which the government takes us to that destination. Right? And it is a very thorough process. Governments get elected based on identified priorities. In Guyana, those priorities are identified in their manifesto. So when governments get elected, their manifesto gives you an insight of their policies, their priorities, the things that would have inspired you to vote for them. they eventually come into office, and then they now have to take those priorities and bring them down into chunks of annual cycles, and to determine how they can achieve those policy goals that they set out to do. In Guyana, the government agencies have very well established budget procedures, governed by law in some instance with the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act and so forth. But in a nutshell, the budget process lasts about 6 months in Guyana, from beginning to end. As a matter of fact, it's a continuous process because every budget agency has budget committees and so forth that are required by policy to meet on a quarterly basis. The thing about budget is that every time you bring a new government on board, you don't recreate or restart. You're supposed to either build or continue and improve and so forth. And that's where the permanent establishment in governments contribute. So the budget process takes about 6 months. It starts out with a circular being provided by the Ministry of Finance that comes out sometime around June month in Guyana. Could be mid-June, that's usually signed by the Finance Secretary at the Ministry of Finance. That budget circular highlights, gives you a review of the state of the economy, gives you some insight into the policy timelines and things of that sort. And then the agencies are required to meet, the budget agencies are required to meet, and the budget agencies in Guyana would be the regional democratic councils, the ministries of government, the sub-agencies, the public corporations, and so forth. Many of them would have started their budget process, if we look at an annual cycle, even before the circular comes out. So they would have started, so when we're planning for 2021, for example, that planning starts sometime in April, May. The circulars come out with timeline and so forth. We have like about 6 to 8 weeks because by the end of August, we got to submit numbers to the Ministry of Finance. Those numbers would have had to been vetted by budget agencies, subcommittees internally, and so forth. The budget requires you to budget for recurring expenditures, capital expenditures, revenues, and things of that sort. When the budget is submitted in August to the Ministry of Finance, it goes through the budgeting section and the planning unit there. There's a section responsible for routine expenditure, section responsible for capital expenditure. They bring them together, they decide policies, revenue, and so forth. And then a series of engagement between those who submitted budgets from the various agencies. Will now have discussions with the Ministry of Finance on areas of priorities and things of that sort. That process will take a few months because that starts in September, October, and the budget has to be submitted to Cabinet as a draft maybe by the end of October, early November, and they have a few weeks to decide on that. Good? So the budget in Guyana involves hundreds of persons in participating. So that there was to give you a quick walkthrough from beginning to end. Of course, there are hundreds of forms that have to be filled out and all of that. Now, what happens in the preparation? So that's just a timeline issue. So a lot of us, when we look at the budget and we listen to the minister's speech who presents it, we hear a lot of financial values and sometimes goals of capital projects that they wish to do. But the budget is a lot more than financial numbers. We don't necessarily see the work plans, the work programs. We don't always see the key performance indicators that are required. Like say, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture will have to have key performance indicator for each one of the agencies. So your work program, your work plan, your key performance indicators are built in. Then you cost out those based on recurring capital budgets and so forth. And then you make those submissions to the ministry. All right. And then the minister and his team pull it together, and then they apply their political goals and so forth that they wish to achieve, policies and so, and budget for debate to Parliament. The debate process on average lasts about 2 to 3 weeks. I think it's been averaging 2 weeks in a full cycle. How the government just came in and we don't have a budget in place for 2020, they will have a very short time to present the budget, maybe 4 weeks, 6 weeks to present the budget. They might not be able to afford 2 weeks of debates because it's a short period of time. they might only probably afford 3 days of debate, for example. After those debates, now that debate process is important because that is where you hear the priorities, as Joseph was talking about just now, being discussed, and the goals and the things that matter to you. Now, prior to reaching to all of there, where we get involved, agencies like the Private Sector Commission, the Chamber of Commerce, the Guyana Manufacturing Association, the unions, and several other agencies are all invited to make submissions, either formally at a meeting or in writing if you can't attend meetings. But we'll come back to that and how we can improve that process. But there's some level of participation taking place in the budget. I'm not sure I covered it there enough for you within the time.
I think that is certainly a lot to chew on. And you'll spend a lot of time going through on the timeline, which set the stage for us to talk about the engagement aspect of it more as we come deep into the program. Richard, I want to come to you on something. Joseph mentioned a very important part about the budget process at the beginning about what a budget is. There's two sides to a budget, naturally. You have spendings, priorities, but you have to finance this spending from somewhere because you have to pay for the things that you want, right? Budget is just an expression of what you want, or one way to describe the budget is an expression of what you want and how you're going to pay for it. So the two sides of the budget is revenues, you have to pay for it, and where you're going to spend it. How exactly, give us an understanding of how in Guyana do we finance the budget? What are the sources of revenues, where they come from, what are the different kinds of revenues? Give us a good understanding of what that is, that side of the budget.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Dan Raj. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here again. And good evening to the gentlemen who are on the panel and to all your viewers and listeners. So the budget, as everyone has explained and adumbrated quite clearly before, it's a very important tool. As you rightly pointed to, if you think about it, an analogy of it perhaps being a personal budget, you obviously have an income, which you have to have your expenditure. So on a personal level, for example, you'd have your income, which you earn, perhaps your salary, perhaps some passive investments, which you may make. And then on the expenditure side, you will have your sustenance, and then you may want to buy a few new things. Now, the national budget or the public budget is a much more complicated process, a much more complicated instrument, but at its fundamental, it's the same. So the government obviously has revenue, and the government obviously has expenditure. Now, from the revenue side, and this is why we'd always see taxation being an integral part of our lives, the government obtains its revenue primarily through taxation and fees, which are implemented at particular points in the government's operation. Now, that taxation obviously depends, some of it depends on the quantum of economic activity that occurs, and then some of it is statutory. So, for example, you have individuals who pay PAYE and taxes, etc., out of their personal income, and that the government doesn't have to depend on the rate of economic activity. But there is also the rate of economic activity that gives more and more taxation to the government. So, for example, a corporation usually has to pay corporation tax. This is why you'll find the private sector, for example, giving its input onto what the fiscal framework or what the government's configuration of taxes should be. So fundamentally on the revenue aspect, this is what you're looking at. You're looking at taxation being the main source of it. So it's essentially divided into corporate taxes. You have personal taxes, you have value-added taxes, and you also have, in Guyana's case, but many countries around the world are beginning to move away from that, excise taxes. So those brackets comprise in Guyana approximately about 80 to 90% of government's revenue. And it's important to know that taxation in Guyana comprises about 19 to 95% of government's revenue, depending on what year you're looking at and depending on what the structure of the economy is at the point in time. Now, obviously, government has expenditure, and the government has what we term recurrent expenditure, which is essentially wages, salaries, and the upkeeping of the government's operation. But they also do have, and very importantly for countries, capital expenditure, which refers to the infrastructure which the government spends on. It refers to all of the capital works, all of essentially the projects which governments undertake. Now, there is...
I want to come back a little bit. I want to bring you back a little bit back to the revenue side, because I hear you mentioning taxation. So naturally, there are several taxes that are part of the financing of the budget. Income tax, corporate profit, tax on corporate profits, value added tax. So there's a number of taxes. We can put them in one bracket. So you have taxes. You also then have a lot of revenues that are coming in from fees and service charges for a board certificate. But other than those two, regardless of how small or big they are, other than those two, service charges and fees and taxes, are there any other source of revenues, or whether you don't call them revenues, income, or whatever of a different term, that comes into the budget that helps to pay for the things that are the spendings that are in the budget?
So I'll get to this, Danraj, because I want the viewers to have a clear understanding of what it is. And at the end, I'll elaborate a little bit more on that. But let's on the expenditure side, you have your capital and your current expenditure, as I was getting to. But in developing countries, you find that governments often spend much more than they receive. So you result with something called the resultant of it is a gap, a deficit. Now that gap or deficit, if you think about it, even on a personal basis, if you're spending more than you're receiving, it obviously has to come from somewhere. So that gap is what is financed by government debt. Now, government debt essentially can come from either overseas, which is termed as external borrowing, or it can come from internal, which is called internal borrowing, or domestic borrowing, domestic debt. So if you think about it, there are two inflows that occur for a government. It's not revenue per se, but there are two inflows that occurs for a government. One is the revenue component, which comes from taxation and fees. And the second component of inflows is that of external financing or internal financing. So there is revenue, and then there is financing, whether external or internal, that comprises inflows. And then there are outflows from government, which is fundamentally the expenditure or the program which you see that the government undertakes annually. Now, why is this important? It's important because debt, much like tax, is something which is a burden on the society. Now, if governments, they already receive revenue, and when governments take our revenue, governments take the revenue from the population to spend on a program of work, not just to catalyze economic growth, but also to ensure that certain social services, etc., are provided. But these social services do not always, or they don't give you returns or generate some growth, etc., in your economy. Now, we'll get into this a little bit later and why this is ultimately important. But I just want to say that those two indicators are also indicators when we speak about budget in terms of the amount that a government expends, the amount of taxation which is levied on the population, as well as the quantum of debt, which is as a result of that year's budget, are two very important indicators where consistently and cumulatively they have an impact on the state of the economy. So I'll offer that as being a very simple explanation of the categories of the budget.
So what I want our viewers to get from this, at least in a very simple layman term, is that when you think of the budget and you think of how we're going to finance that budget, you think of three things broadly. You think of one, the taxes we pay to the government. Two, the fees we pay when you renew your license, when you buy a board certificate, or you pay a service charge somewhere. And 3, we have to borrow. It's important for us to keep that at the back of our mind, because as a population also, we have a responsibility that when we put our priorities and we think about the things we want as a society, we want better roads, we want a new highway here, or we want a hydro plant, it would be responsible of us to also think about how we're going to pay for these things. Okay, so we don't often think about that side. Now, since I'm on the issue of thinking about things, Joseph, I want to ask you, there's a concept that is floating around in this entire discussion and debate about budgeting and how to improve the budgeting process and how to put the public in public budgeting, so to speak. And this phrase, open budgeting, it seems to be going around. Participatory budgeting seems to be going around, at least in the literature. Explain to us what this means and why, again, this is important. I always come back to this, what it means and why it's important.
Don Raj, certainly. Before I do that, I would like to respond to one thing that Richard has said, which I think in general is very, very accurate, when he made the analogy to public budgeting being very much like the budgeting that you would do as a family. I would, however, point out one significant difference between public budgeting and budgeting for your family, in that as you go to work, you know pretty much what your income is. It is prescribed by whatever your occupation is and whatever other sources of income you have, right? But in the public sphere, the amount of income that you have is very much a choice, as well as how you spend it. So that in the public sector, in public budgeting, it's important to focus on that revenue side of the budget as well. And for people who want to participate in the budget process to understand that whatever the current revenue side of the budget looks like, it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. And again, when we talk about if you're not at the table, you're likely to be on the menu, certainly in any government situation where well-financed corporations are steering a lot of the conversation, they will start from an assumption that revenue should be reduced as much as possible because it means less taxation on them. But I think it's important from people thinking about participating in the budget process to question the assumption that whatever revenues that are currently available necessarily have to be the case going forward. And it's important to look at that revenue side of the budget and what options and choices and priorities there are there, as well as on the spending side. But with that, I'll get to your question with respect to what does participatory budgeting look like, and how do we get there? I guess I would define open participatory budgeting as follows. It would be a process by which public input is incorporated throughout the budget process to the end that the resultant budget document and budget that gets lived by the government adequately reflects the priorities of the government and adequately and appropriately distributes the fiscal burden in accordance with the benefits that are provided. So again, the operative idea here is that people participate so that their priorities are incorporated into the budget process, both on the revenue and the expenditure sides. So I guess with that as sort of what it is, what it might look like, how do we get there? And I think you mentioned something early on that's incredibly important, which is facilitating a public understanding of the budget and the process by which it is created. And I would ask the question with respect to Guyana, is there transparency around the budget? Is it readily accessible to the public? And do the public readily know what that process looks like, and where their opportunities are to influence that and have input into that process? I think in that regard, it's important that there be an ongoing public cache of information about the budget, but also that there is regular information sessions provided to the population throughout the year, particularly in that 6-month window. We talked about the budget process being particularly active. And I think it's also important, to the extent that we want that budget to reflect priorities, that the budget information that is provided in a way that enables people to understand not just the spending and the dollars and cents of it, but what that spending really means in terms of outcomes that they would hope to achieve in the budget process. And this gets to the whole concept of outcome budgeting, looking at not just the dollars and cents, not just at how efficiently we're spending money in the public sector, but the effectiveness. Not just how are we doing these things, are they efficient, but are we doing the right things to get us to the outcomes that we want to see? And that really involves looking at the spending side of the budget, not as spending per se, but investments. What are we investing our money in, and what do we expect to achieve in response to the investments that we make? And then ultimately, are we getting those outcomes?
And you know, Joseph, you hit something that is squarely on the head with something that our newly elected president has said only a day or less than 24 hours ago when he constituted his cabinet. And that is an emphasis on outcomes, deliverables.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important that the public and we all as citizens understand that when the government spends on a particular item or on an issue, on a program, it's an investment that is making in its people. And what you want in that process is to make sure those spendings deliver a return to the people. That return might be in more opportunities, it might be in more freedoms, it might be more empowerment, it might be more knowledge, more access. It can be a lot of things, but certainly it must deliver some whatever the intended outcomes are for that process. Ramesh, this puts me squarely back into your court here. You talk a lot about what goes on in the budget process at the agency level. You mention a little bit also about the fact that there would be solicitation of views from respective agencies and other players in the economy to give input. Talk to us about two things. Are there other forms of participation that are happening in the budget process that is focusing more on the people, the individuals on the ground, communities? And if they're not, or whatever is there, how do you see us moving that process forward, making the process more transparent, more open, more engaging, more participatory, in that way that we can lead to truly that when we have a document, the people owns it, the government owns it, and everybody owns it, and that's our budget.
All right, I certainly believe that there's a lot more room for improvement in the participatory process of the budget. I get to feel, I mean, if I wasn't involved in some of the consultations and so forth, I would get to feel as though I don't know what's happening, all right? Now, government is quite a complex structure with different levels and different mechanisms of acquiring information. Remember, a lot of the budgeting information is done by a lot of the agencies. Now, citizens' participation in the budget happens through when officials visit areas and they get complaints and those kinds of mechanisms. There's a lot of assumptions on what the community needs also sometimes without discussing with what the community needs. Now, the fact that we are talking about budget, it means that we don't have unlimited resources. All right? You know, when we talk about a class of society who lives on a budget, it means that they have a standard set of income with limiting factors and so forth. And then there's a class in society that spends unlimited and don't have anything to worry about. A country doesn't have that kind of resources. And that's why a budget is necessary. Now, the participation process is more from an institutional basis from what I've seen so far. So much of the participation and views are solicited from formally organized groups of civil society and other members of society. To have an open town hall in a particular village, like for example, the local government system in the US, for example, is a lot more skewed to get views out of people as compared to, so Guyana is more heavily based on central government versus local government participation. So where you will have borough participation or city participation and state participation, then federal participation in the US, for example, you don't have that high level of participation in Guyana because I would say if the monies are being spent within the country, 80% of it is decided by central government and 20% of it is being decided by local entities. And local entities don't have a significant powerful say. In more of the developed countries, it is the inverse of that. Good? And I would say one way of getting more participation is empowering more of the local organization, local government organization. That's one way of getting more participation, because those local government bodies, which are the neighborhood democratic councils, the regional democratic councils, are closer to the problems of the people in those areas. Good? And they can be in a position to acquire information on what's bothering them in the area. So when the government proceeds on a program and says that we're going to go build roads, the communication needs to be said, okay, in this community, we can't build your road because we believe crime is important and we're putting up a police station. Now, the members of the community, through their local government organs and representatives, can say, you know what, we prefer you to build a road rather than build a police station. Now, a lot more room for that kind of dialogue is necessary, right? And the structures need to be put in place. So now that we've been having a level of frequency of local government elections now, I believe with a devolution of power more to the local organs can contribute greatly to that participation. In the meanwhile, we're waiting for that to happen. Cabinet and the government usually have what they call cabinet outreaches that they fan out across the country, either before budget or after budget, and they try to listen to people of their problem. Some people accuse them of being pretensive and just being out there for political reasons and so forth. But some people who are good at what they do actually do listen to the people in those communities. And then they come back and they filter those items down into their policy and into their budgets and so forth. More of that could happen. Good? That people can really understand what's happening in communities. For the last 18 months or so, I've seen politicians traverse the entire country and understand every nook and cranny of the area. That, in my view, will give them a tremendous advantage in the policy development aspect. But there are lots more tools in open budgeting. You know, we have a lot more technology available now that can acquire data and feedback from people. You know, in a business, we get feedback from individuals using our customer complaints mechanism, customer feedback mechanism. We do deliberate focus group studies, deliberate market assessments, and so forth. Those kinds of mechanisms needs to be formalized a little bit more in Guyana, for example. It happens, but the public need to be made much more aware. The other issue that we have is that the budget seems to be a surprise process. A lot of people wait in anticipation to hear the policies that are going to be developed. I believe that the 180-day period that's allocated for the budget, that a lot more information needs to be made available earlier in the budget process. So communities can say, okay, you're thinking of 10 projects, and we only have money to do 5 projects. Help us to decide which of the 5 projects, not government decide which 5 projects and bring it down to the community. So if that openness of the process occur, there will be less surprises in the budget, and the budget will be much more meaningful to the people, because they will say that, you know what, you were telling me you're building a road. I didn't know you were going to build that. But when they actually put the road, the members of the community will say, you know what, yes, that's what we recommended. We've seen it. The government is listening to the process and so forth. So there are lots more room for improvement in that regard locally.
Ramesh, what you just said, on a different day, I could have just taken all of what you said and put it squarely in an entire discussion that is called good governance. Yeah? Because again,
that's what budgets are about.
Exactly. And I think I just want to highlight a couple of things that you mentioned, which is for our viewers, even there's certainly room for improvement and growth here. And Ramesh, you talk about some of this. But understand also that when officials visit your area, right now we have cabinet outreach. You have officials reaching out. Make it your duty to engage with them, because that is one of those few moments where you have a chance to say, here is the issues that we're facing in a community, and you communicate that to the individuals. So I know sometimes people think that, okay, we heard a minister come into town, I don't have time to really go but such a sort of that kind of attitude may not be the best way to approach the situation. Certainly, if you can't make it, you can't make it. But seize the moment to engage with your lawmakers and your policymakers when they are in town. That way, you get a chance to communicate your views. You have also, Ramesh, you have also mentioned.
Just before you continue there, Dan, right? Just permit me to make one intervention. Yeah. In this era, you don't need to wait for them to come to town. You go to their Facebook page, and all of them are there. You go to their Twitter accounts, they're there. The ministries have email addresses. Keep writing, keep telling them, send photographs, complain about the issues. Eventually, they will listen to you.
Yes, and that is 100%. I'm happy you interrupted me to bring that in, because again, that is, we have to find new ways in the current environment. And even certainly if this was a world without COVID, just with the advent and the growth of technology in the process and bringing governance closer to the people, use these tools to engage your lawmakers. Richard, in that spirit of in the current environment, I want to shift gears to the question of, traditionally, you mentioned that, you know, the amount of revenues that a government collect is in large measure depending on how well the economy is doing, how many people are interacting, how many purchases you're making, how the economic activities are moving. The more economic activities, the more a portion of some taxes is going to come out from that to go to the government coffers that it can use to reinvest in the economy. But as you might imagine with COVID, and certainly in the future that we're looking ahead of us, traditional forms of economic activities are not going to cut it. We're not going to be able to have the kinds of road parties and get together and mass events that brings a lot of transactions the way it used to be. So here's my question to you. Prior to this event, in the current crisis, largely governments have been dependent on tax revenues in the traditional sense. Taxes from income and taxes from sales tax from people buying stuff. How can we diversify that revenue portfolio? And certainly within the context of COVID, what new mechanism, what new streams of revenue can we think about? And even if, again, if in a world in which COVID just disappears and we're back to some normalcy, it still makes sense to diversify your revenue stream. Tell us a little about the options that are on the table and what we can look at.
Right. Dan Raj, thanks so much for that. Now, it's important for us to understand, as I would have mentioned earlier, what the revenues constitute. The revenues constitute a certain amount of inflow to government, but they are not the only categories of inflow. In my view, beyond taxes and fees, and ensuring that that has a proper structure and one in which it's not onerous or burdensome on the population, government's revenue or its ability to garner revenue is very limited. So what you obviously have to look at is how government can ensure that inflows exist innovatively, or that their expenditure program, which they have, can be done in an innovative way. Now, let me just go through a couple things which come to my mind almost immediately. In a situation of COVID in particular, and looking at what is happening in the economy. Now, the fact of fiscal policy, which is essentially the government's program, the government spends in certain areas, and those areas, they fundamentally depend on what is happening or what the prevailing context is nationally. Now, you have a situation where in COVID, you are really looking to either keep your economy afloat, or by the time we reach to the budget, you're essentially looking to kickstart your economy, get your economy back on track. Now, for someone like myself looking at this process, I think one of the very first things that one would have to do is ensure that there's a reprioritizing of the budget and how the expenditure is being configured. There are a number of line items in there where priorities need to be adjusted based on the prevailing context. Now, that in itself frees a certain amount of space for the government to be able to spend in those areas that are of higher priority, or those areas which may stimulate the economy more. for those who are introduced to economics, the areas which have a greater multiplier effect in the economy. Now, some of the other things which governments can do, I believe, to ensure that their expenditure is supported at this point in time, is really utilizing this point to kickstart the public-private partnership model. Now, when I spoke earlier, I made an allusion to, just for the purposes of understanding, to a family and to a family's budget, etc. But there is a fundamental difference when one looks at a government. A government essentially has what we call a sovereign guarantee, or the government itself has access to the printing of money, and they have the ability to back up what they are putting forward, the word of the state. So the state essentially has a particular guarantee that it can give to you as an individual or as to you as an investor. Now, the state, in my view, outside of using traditional tools of financing and traditional tools of raising revenue, the state can utilize that position which it has in terms of sovereign guarantee to be able to finance what it is going to do, or to be able to induce the private sector to finance what they may deem as being priorities. So, for example, if one wants to do a transformative project which may kickstart a particular area, for example, let's say building a small hydro plant in an area, or maybe ensuring that we have rail to some part of Guyana, and begin to kickstart the economy and begin to really prioritize and push the multiplier into the economy, or to induce spending in the economy, one can begin to look at public-private partnerships. Now, it is not necessarily that you are diversifying revenue in that case, but what you are doing is that you are making the government's expenditure program or program of work become a reality, or that you can actually realize that. Now, that's a very important point, because it's utilizing the state and its ability to back up, as well as some amount of moral suasion. Now, another element which I believe is very important, particularly within the context of Guyana, is for us to begin to perhaps look at smaller bonds, which can ensure that we have capital which may be hoarded, or capital which may be stored. You know, Guyana is an informal economy, and there's quite a great quantum of cash circulating in the economy, which is not reflected in the banking sector and in the financial institutions. It is one way which we can actually tap in to that cash that is outside of the economy, persons who may have savings, persons who may be hoarding, persons who may have precious metals, etc., which may just be sitting. It is one way which we can begin to mobilize funding which is sitting in the private sector, or which is sitting in the population just very idly. Now, the government essentially can use, once again, its position as a sovereign, its position to be able to guarantee a rate of interest and a rate of return, to offer those persons for their funding. Now, why, once again, is this important? Because in the absence of being able to fully diversify streams of revenue, tantamount to what a company may do in terms of diversification of portfolio to earn more revenue, a government can actually begin to find more innovative ways to give itself space. Now, I think that is key, particularly in Guyana moving forward. So we're looking at public-private partnerships. We ought to look at reconfiguring the program of work for government. I believe that we also have to find ways to begin to involve the population and induce the capital which is sitting idly through incentive and interest rates and utilizing government. So I believe fundamentally that is where the key is for government and for government in Guyana to be able to have much more space with which they can operate. Now, if you think about it, the economy will only be able to grow so fast. The economy will only be able to expand the tax base at such a particular rate. Now, outside of your traditional monetary policy, which let's not get into that as yet, but outside of that, it is another way of us being able to inject money into the economy and for government to innovatively craft its fiscal policy framework. So I'm just going to offer that, Dan Raj, at this time, and of course answer anything follow.
So I think you mentioned two important things that I see there is that, okay, you have tax revenues that are coming in, you have some revenues that are coming in from fees. But one way in which you can increase the amount of revenue that you have in a counterintuitive way, in a sense, is smart spendings. Because if you start to clean out the spendings and get rid of programs that may not be delivering on some outcomes, serving no purpose, or just wasted inefficiency, invariably what you're doing is increasing the amount of money that you have to spend. So that's one way. The second thing you also mentioned indirectly is leveraging public dollars. And it's a concept that I haven't heard a lot in our development financing framework, but it's something that is very common in North America and in Europe, where governments come to the table and say, look, we have X and Y investment to make. Government is going to put 60% of the funding. Private sector come up with the 40%, and here is how we're going to draft the partnership. A lot of time we talk about the partnership, but it's not oftentimes we frame it in the context that we're going to leverage the public dollars. Joseph, I have a question that I want to spin off of you from this, but before I go to that question, I want you to comment on precisely this, because I know you have extensive experience on this. How can we diversify? What other mechanisms and streams of income can government look at? Bearing in mind that every time you use the word taxation, you have 10 people left you out of the 11 that was behind of you. So what other options are there on the table to increase revenues?
Yeah. So Dan Raj, okay.
Sorry, yeah, Joseph.
No, go ahead. Joseph. If you had something to say.
No, this is the question I asked Richard earlier, so I want you to comment on the Joseph.
Yeah, you know, I think most of the sources of revenue are potential sources of revenue are pretty clear to governments. It becomes a choice of which ones they want to use. Richard's mentioned corporate taxes, which is certainly a significant portion, I think, of virtually any government's tax base or revenue sources. There are individual taxes, whether they be excise taxes, sales taxes, income taxes on individuals. And then, as you mentioned, there are fees and for direct services. I think the important thing to think about in this context is, again, making certain in any governmental budgetary decisions that you're matching the beneficiaries of the services that are provided with the revenues that are coming in. And this gets to the whole question of whether an income tax system is regressive or progressive. Is it taking more of the incomes of higher income people versus lower income people? When you talked about fees, again, the idea there is to marry, if there's a small section of the population that's getting benefit from something, then that's more appropriate to fund from fees rather than general taxation. And then to the whole issue of debt, again, it's matching the benefit to the cost. Infrastructure investments, which have a life of 30 years, you don't necessarily want to put all on the backs of today's taxpayers. You want to be paying for those over the useful life. So you're looking, again, through debt to do that. But again, to your question more directly, there are only so many sources of revenues. Governments know what they are, and it comes down to which ones they choose to use. And if revenues are insufficient and the government has the will to increase revenues, then they've got to make those difficult choices as to whether they increase, put a new revenue source, be it a tax or whatever else, in place. But to the original point that you made, Dan Raj, this is where it becomes important for people to be involved and understand the implications of the revenue side of the budget as well as the expenditure side of the budget.
Yeah, and so I'm going to go to your question, but I think just to cap off what you said, as citizens, maybe the next time we hear the word taxes or we hear the word fees or we say, okay, we would like to have X and Y, it might also, or especially if we're saying that we want to put a fee on something or raise a fee on something, it would not be wise to just shun that discussion, but the follow-up question there should be is, okay, what is the benefit that I'm going to get from this? Because if you can tie the benefit for what you're paying for then you might realize it's worth the trade-off, or it might not be worth it, but it certainly informs a better conversation. Let me go to the question that I have for you here, Joseph. Our president, recently elected president, you know, he made a stunning statement in one of his press conferences recently. And it's an observation that the Institute, the Budget and Policy Institutes, have also observed over the years when we're looking at budget analysis. And he said it best. He said right now, there are some programs that are spending $500 to implement a $100 program. So just think about the magnitude of wastage and inefficiency that is there. So my question to you here is this. How do you ensure budgets deliver on their intended outcomes?
Well,
what checks and provisions, what checks and balance and systems, whether it's a policy, whether it's an administrative rule, what are all the tools available to achieve that goal, making sure that budget deliver on their outcomes?
Well, here's the wonderful things about budgets, which is they usually have a 1 or in some cases a 2-year life. So at the end of the budget process, you have an exceptional opportunity to look at what you've done and see what is working and what is not working. And if you don't take advantage of that opportunity, then you deserve what you end up getting out of that process. So it's very encouraging that your new leadership is focused on that fact and that question and want to look at those things. Now, when I think about evaluation, you know, you can look at it at 3 different levels. And I think what most often happens is at the end of a budget year, the math is tallied, okay? We projected income of X and expenditures of Y. We ended up with more revenue than we expected or less revenue, and we spent a little bit more, a little bit less revenue. That to me is the minimal, what you've got to do. But in many cases, that's as far as evaluation goes. You look at the numbers. The next level, to my way of thinking, is to the point that you raised and that your leadership has raised about a $500 expenditure on $100 program or $100 worth of benefit, is how efficiently did we deliver the services that we set out to deliver? We thought we were going to get X. We ended up with benefits of $100, but we spent this much. That is a program that is ripe for restructuring, reevaluation. Does that program need to be there at all? Can we deliver those services in a more efficient way? And of course, in this whole context of looking at efficiency, it comes to looking at waste and fraud and corruption and those kind of things as well. So that's kind of a second level, looking at whether there's waste and whether there has been an efficient use of the resources that have been made available in the budget. But to my way of thinking, ultimately, you've got to get to a third level of looking at budgets at the end of the process, and that is to look at outcomes, right? Again, I talked earlier about looking at expenditures not as expenditures, but as investments. What outcomes are we investing in? Not just what services are we providing? What outcomes are we investing in? Did we get those outcomes for the investments that we made in those areas? And if not, do we need to look at different ways of doing things? And again, it comes to that question of effectiveness of the governmental programs that we're putting in place. So I think it's incredibly important that there be an evaluation at the end of a budget year across all of those ways of looking at the budget. And again, you know, we think of the budget process primarily as the development process, the 6-month period that Ramesh talked about. But budgeting is an ongoing process. There's the development during that fiscal year. You've got to evaluate what you're doing, make sure that your budget remains along the lines fiscally of what you thought it should be. But at the end of that process, it's incumbent upon government and it's incumbent upon the people that are interested in that budget process to look very closely at what that budget produced and whether there are ways to do things differently to get the outcomes and meet the priorities that they've set in that budget process in the first instance.
Are there, quickly, are there commitment devices and provisions that can be weaved into the budget document itself? And for our viewers, whenever you hear the term budget, there's another concept that is oftentimes used to describe the budget as well. It's also referred to as the Appropriations Act, right? So which is a bill that is passed in the parliament. So when you hear parliament approve the budget, it's a bill that was approved, voted on, and it got approval. Are there commitment devices, Joseph, that can be weaved into the Appropriation Act, the budget process itself, that makes sure that at the end of the budget process, that they go back to doing some of those evaluations and thinking carefully about how did we do, how did we perform that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely, Dars. I mean, that can be written into the legislation that encompasses the budget, that embodies the budget. But I think it's important that as a government, although it's certainly good to have those things written into the legislation, it's important that the whole concept and the importance of evaluation be built into the government process itself, the administrative aspects of the government. So it's good that the legislature says you need to do this. And I think it's good that they then in turn look at the results of those evaluations if they incorporate them into the legislation. But ultimately, I think it works best if the whole concept of constant evaluation of both efficiency and effectiveness be instilled into the administrative apparatus of government so that they're taking that upon themselves without someone from the outside having to say, this is something that you need to do. So much of budgeting tends to be incremental in any event, and it goes on without looking closely. I believe it was Socrates who said the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, the unexamined operations of government are really not worth going on. And that whole ethos of evaluation of what we're doing needs to be weaved into the entire apparatus of government.
So it's good practice. Adopt a good practice instead of having to call for the legislation to say do X and Y. Ramesh, I have to come to you to help us understand this better, because at the very beginning of this conversation, we talked about so many ways in which you can view the budget as, what it can be looked at as a statement of priorities, the goals that you want to achieve, an expression of your values, some numbers, yes, of money that we intend to spend. But when you think about it, the average person in Guyana, when we think about our development goals and how the budget is going to impact the economy, we generally tend to think about two things: jobs, how we're going to stimulate creating new jobs because people want jobs, and that is at the backbone of any economy, and also helping to make sure that the most vulnerable portions of your population are those parts of the population that are struggling, to make sure that they're meeting basic needs. And they're empowered through their consumption and their spendings to be able to participate in an economy in a very good way. How do you approach those two objectives, those goals with your budget? What are some of the priorities that you might look at to say, okay, I think this is going to do well. It's going to lend a good hand in stimulating job creation. It's going to lend a good hand in helping to lift families that are at the bottom of the income ladder up the ladder. What do you look at? What do you look for?
All right, thank you. Before I answer that question, permit me just to make a comment on what was being discussed. The ultimate tool to ensure that outcomes are achieved are elections, right? That's why we believe in democratic process. The election cycles may be too long in some instances, 5 years. At the presidential level, it's probably okay. You might have seen local government doing 2 years, and Congress and so forth, doing different timelines and things of that sort. Now, so that is what I would like to say. The ultimate tool to ensure that your outcomes are achieved are elections, because in your election campaigns and materials that you present, you would have promised certain outcomes to be achieved. And then your ultimate measure of that performance is on the day of polls, whether people agree that you have delivered for them, all right? On the other issue of revenue generation, before I come back to your question there.
Go on, take it.
It is Richard touched on something which is a sovereign guarantee. So without any cash, once people have confidence in your economy, all right, and you've been doing things to ensure that you have good governance and good international relations, and so just by giving the guarantee, you can raise funding both from a private and both for private investment and public investments. I think that that's an excellent thing. But what drives an economy more than, we talk about taxation, and we talk about all those other things that government needs as revenue. But you know what we need? The business community is a participant in the economy, all right? But before I go there, think of a family. You have a mother and a father, and you have a child. eventually they try to do everything for that child so that that child is not dependent on them for the rest of their life. Good? So that mother and father is like the government. The government don't want to take care of you for your whole life. I mean, there are certain public good and service that they will have to provide to you over that period of time. So when does the government really need to take care of you in that context? Parents take care of the children when they're babies and when they're kids until they become adult. And then there's a next level of care that's required when you become a senior, whereby you have no kids or anybody to take care of you at that point in time. And just like that, the government operate, but on a larger scale. Now, to make sure that those kids are independent, we got, of course, got to spend on education and a whole host of other things. But to make sure the independence. Now, the government is not the solver of every problem in society. We each make our own decision of problems that we have. We find our own jobs. We do all kinds of things to maintain our economic self, all right? I'll give you one example. Good governance that leads to confidence, all right? Now, confidence ain't got no costs or cash flow requirement or anything. All you gotta do is ensure that confidence is in place by fair play, equitable treatment, good process, good systems, and all comes down back to good visioning, good governance, good institutions and things of those sort. Now, when you have those mechanisms in that ecosystem, for example, you have set the stage for businesses to prosper so that we, because businesses will say, okay, this is a country that I have confidence in. I will go mobilize money. The people that, because we respect human rights, because we respect good governance, because we have good international relations, the international capital environment will say, a business in Guyana will be successful, I will back them. Now, none of that requires government money. All that requires is fair treatment, equitable treatment, and things of that sort, all right? So that in itself helps you to generate income, and a lot of that is done by independent agency, and that's making the government smaller and economy becoming more self-sufficient and things of that sort, all right? Coming on back to your question in specific. I know just remind me of what you were asking.
No, that's quite okay. In fact, let me just say, I think it's a brilliant point that you have made, that one way governments have to think about raising revenues is how not to raise it themselves, but let the private sector raise it. And you touch profoundly on what in the economic literature is referred to as creating an enabling environment. That's basically what you explained there, and in a very perfect way. So yes, ensure the rules of law are maintained, ensure fairness, ensure the government institutions work the way they ought to work, and guarantee that we have stability, economic and political stability. And that in itself would generate encouragement from the different players. Amazing point, and I thank you for bringing that on the floor. The question I was asking you is going a little bit more in the direction of understanding priorities. Two of those important priorities that budget tend to address is creating jobs, creating opportunities for people to get meaningful employment. Meaningful employment comes meaningful spendings, which again add to the economic engine. And at the same time, you also have some more consumption side leaning priorities, which deals with the issue of meeting basic needs for families that are struggling, helping those who are low down the ladder. As you said, taking care of the child so that tomorrow they can take care of themselves, equipping them with what they need. What would you look for in the budget to have a sense of, or to walk away and to say, you know what, I'm okay. I think I like the way the budget approaches this issue. This is going to drive job creation, and this is also going to help lift families. What are those things that you would look for?
All right, so budgeting and managing an economy is a balancing act, right? It's a circular environment, and you have to balance several priorities. And they say if you take all the economists in the world and you put them side by side, they will never come to a conclusion or reach.
That is true.
Right? Because we all have to find this. It's like a tightrope you're walking, and you have to find that balance. I believe it is Lord Kelvin and then further modified by Peter Drucker that says that if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So, one of the basic things in Guyana is that we have not been measuring unemployment on a quarterly basis or on a monthly basis. We've seen job numbers coming out of the developed world. Regularly, quarterly, the jobs report are produced. We only know of unemployment in Guyana when we do the 10-year annual census. Good? So one of the things we need to start to do, I mean, my big disappointment in budgets over the years, the previous government, the one prior to that, current one that was there prior, is that we have not been talking about unemployment, what it is, how the budget impacts on unemployment, how much jobs the budget will create. So first, we have to put a mechanism of measuring what truly is unemployment or underemployment. Good. We need to set a benchmark of where we would like it to be. We must know the kind of jobs and the number of jobs we want to prevent. And we can't wait 10 years for that number, all right, when a census is being done. We need that number on a regular basis. Now, there's a way of getting some preliminary or proxy information from places like the National Insurance Scheme, if they can publish those kinds of number monthly or quarterly so we can know. Now, the number of persons who contribute to the scheme on a monthly basis will give you an idea whether people lose their job or whether they gain job or whether the number is static or whether it is growing and things of that sort. So, now, the job creators. It is the business community that is the job creators. It is those economic or those enterprises that are job creators. It is the farmers, it is the fishers, and all of those that create jobs. Good? And it comes right down back to the point of having an enabling environment to ensure that business is successful. Good? You can't be a government that is jealous of the success of business. The success of a business gives you taxes. Good? Now, there are about 4 groups of people who benefit from the income in the business. They are the employees, they're the shareholders, they're governments, they're the investors. Good? Note that government is a beneficiary of the income in a business. So government should want to see businesses succeed to create that level of employment. Of course, your social services, your education and all that prepares people for the jobs, all right? So I would like to see a lot more focus. And when we're talking about our budget, we know exactly what is our unemployment, where are the sectors that are greatly affected, if it's youths, if it's the middle-aged grouping or the elderly or differently able. We must know that kind of figure. Now, poverty reduction is also a significant area. What are the measures of poverty and the benchmarks that they have internationally? Now, GDP is not the only measure of success of an economy. And if we look at our budgets over the year, we boast about having good growth in the economy for 25 years or however years, consistently, 15 years or whatever it is, 3-4% per annum. But is that really a growth? This year, we're projecting 40% growth in the economy based on the revision and things of that sort. Does that really mean that hundreds or thousands of persons are going to benefit from that? Now, the economy will grow by 40%, but still 30,000 people can't find jobs. Good? And that same 30,000 people existed prior to last December, and the jobs are not increasing. So that's what you call jobless growth. Now, when it comes to poverty, the indicators of poverty needs to be identified, some of which is identified in the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. So all of those numbers of what we talk as the outcomes and the key performance indicators need to be factored in. So governments need to be held accountable, in my view, to say that, okay, poverty is 60%. This is how we have determined what poverty is of the population, whatever indicator that could be, household income, asset base, number of mortgages or whatever it is. And we need to say this is the direction we need to take it. And in measuring those numbers and telling us that, we had 60,000 persons living in poverty. They were unable to send their kids to school. Now we only have 50,000 because 10,000 are now sending their kids to school. Or we can say we have 70,000 who are sending their kids to school, but 30,000 kids turn up every day without being hungry at school. Now it comes down to a complex system of measuring and managing those numbers, all right? Now, providing jobs for people is better than providing grant and income and all of that on a subsidized basis. Good? So it comes down back to the issue of confidence in the economy, good governance, and all of those other principles as we manage the economy going forward. And I remind you, if you can't measure it, you can't change it. All right.
That's certainly.
Raj, I know I promised you that I want to stay for a very long time here.
Yes.
I really have to go, and I would like to seek your permission to leave at this juncture.
Yes.
If I have your permission.
We're about to wrap up as well, but Ramesh, thank you so much for the time that you were able to afford us in the discussion. It was a pleasure, and we certainly look forward to having you again on the program.
Good.
So thank you.
Thank you. Joseph, Richard, take care. Enjoy the rest of the conversation.
Ramesh, thank you.
Yes. Gentlemen, we're coming up to the end of the time that we have. Richard, there is one other question that I would like you to address before I ask both of you to give some closing remarks. And that is...
Raj, if I can, I'd just like to mention one thing. We're speaking quite a bit here tonight about something called results-based budgeting, essentially. And it's important to note that Guyana already has results-based budgeting in place. But what from the public administration side, what we're really seeing, if you observe closely, the main problem is that the culture of results-based budgeting permeating the public administration system. There's an institutional inertia that's really preventing that culture from permeating, and it's mapping itself broader into preventing development from happening because we're unable to have these key performance indicators being measured. Just one other point that I want to make before we go on is that we were speaking earlier about spending on $500 and $100 program, and I think that it's very, very important to draw to the attention of the viewers and the listeners just what the configuration of the public expenditure in Guyana has been over the past decade. And let's bring some numbers in here. 2010, you had personal emoluments and wages of central government being 28.2 billion. So that's you're paying 28.2 billion on a 49 billion program. Now, the program, that's capital expenditure program. So the capital expenditure program was about 1.7 times larger than the spending on personal emoluments. Fast forward to 2019's budget, and this is a very telling statistic. Central government's personal emoluments was 70.9 billion. That's fine. But the capital expenditure was just $69 billion. Which means that your configuration has reached to a point where you're actually, for every dollar on capital expenditure, you're actually spending more to manage than actually what you are spending, which is fundamentally a very big problem. And it's the macroeconomic configuration of the Guyanese economy, which I personally believe is a major problem and is critically affecting the growth of the economy in those non-oil sectors. So I just wanted to stick that in before we
Look, I think it is very important because it goes back to the point again that we've been making all the time. It is not smart if you're spending $5 to implement $1. That simply violates financial and economic sense, common sense even. Let me get to you to the question because I know we're pressed for time. We talk a lot about the COVID situation, and we reference some of the fact that we're not operating in a normal economic time here, right? I think Joseph stressed on this a little bit at the beginning that we're going to have to figure out a way how to treat this as the new normal. Find a way for the economy to operate in some, whether it's second gear or it's third gear, and as we figure this as we go. How do you think that necessarily means we're going to have to see some amount of that prioritization reflected in the budgeting? How do you think, in a very simple and short way, how do you think the budget will aid or can aid this reorienting of the economy and adaptation of the economy? What are some of the things you would look for that you think is going to help that adaptation process and redefining?
The first thing is actually how we even prepare it at a fundamental level. Because when you think about it, if we are at a juncture where we do not utilize technology, we do not have citizens participating, we do not map them and rope them into the budget preparation process now, then whenever will we be able to? This will be the budget that has to be the most people-oriented budget. This will have to be the budget which is crafted by the people really and truly for the people. And this is the one where we must utilize technology. So I believe that not just in Guyana, but governments all over the world, if you view Harvard Business Review, economists, etc., you'll see what they talk about. What they talk right now is we really need to begin to move to a new paradigm of economic thinking. And I think this one has to be one where you have greater citizen participation through utilizing the digital technologies available to us and the ICT, etc. So that for me is the fundamental, and that is what I want to say, because once you have citizens participating, you have a government that understands that the citizens equate the voters and they understand what they want, they will begin to tailor their programs, etc., more attuned and more in line with what is required for the benefit of all.
In essence, part of the reorientation means spending some money to make sure people have access to internet and good internet, because certainly a big part of the economy is now moving online. And if you don't have access to online, you can't participate in the economy, right?
And you know, more particularly, not just internet, but also mobile internet, where people, when they're out and about or walking around, they also have that. You know, in Guyana, you have 8 out of 10 persons rather, who have who actually own mobile phones, but only 4 out of 10 have access to mobile data on their mobile phones. That in itself is a very telling statistic, because how does that impact the person living in the rural communities? You know, Guyana is a geographically dispersed area, so mass of land. So it's a very interesting point for us in the juncture of Guyana, and we certainly need to utilize the opportunity moving forward.
Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you for your closing statements, and I would like to urge you to put that in a little bit of context for me. So what I will say is, to cap this off, is to say, you know, Joseph, our economy is sitting at the crossroad of greatness. And I say that because we have an economy that, as you heard Ramesh mention before he left, is projecting 40% growth. But he really nicely put that in context, because that is simply because we're now starting to produce oil. We're an oil exporter now. So that's certainly going to reflect in our GDP as a big growth in the economy, but certainly not real growth in a sense of jobs growth and quality growth. But again, we're sitting on the precipice of greatness. We have a new administration that have taken seat, who have hit all the markers that you will want a government to hit. They have put a cabinet in place that reflects diversity, brand new thinking, merging experience with technocrats and with people from all sides of walk of life. And the president has also laid his mandate very explicitly out. We want results, we want outcomes. So certainly at the stage where we are, we're hitting the markers. In that context, and in the context of what we discussed tonight about the role of budgeting, the budgeting process and budgets, what would be your leave and your takeaway message for our Guyanese people and our lawmakers?
Well, first of all, Dhanraj, thank you for having me participate in this. I have learned an awful lot from Ramesh and Richard, and I hope that your viewers have as well. But just to sum up, you've talked about 3 things that are incredibly important in terms of being transformational. It's economic growth that's coming to Guyana now, it's the new leadership, and it's the brave new world that's going to come in the wake of this pandemic. You know, the world was transforming at an incredible rate to begin with. I think the pandemic is going to, if anything, accelerate that rate of change. And because of all of those, I mean, in the most stable of environments, it's incredibly important to look at budgets, look at what they do, look at the priorities that are there, look at the ways in which a government does business, and look for opportunities to improve them. Under the 3 things we've just talked about now, it's even more magnitudes of order, more important that those things take place. And I think it's great that your organization are really focusing on these issues and surfacing these issues. And I think the future of Guyana is only going to be better because of that. So thank you for having me participate. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Joseph. Richard?
Dhanraj, this is the 4th time I'll do this in public discourse on matters related to budgeting, public budgeting, because I believe it is of utmost importance. And you've heard me say it already. If you look at the premise of the social contract that exists in Guyana, that is our constitution, the one that exists between the state and the society. Article 13 sets it out very clearly. What is the objective of the political system? And I'll just read it and end. The principal objective of the political system of the state is to establish an inclusionary democracy by providing increasing opportunities for the participation of citizens and their organizations in the management and decision-making processes of the state, with particular emphasis on those areas of decision-making that directly affect their well-being. That, I believe, wraps up from a philosophical perspective where we are to go with public budgeting in the future in Guyana.
Thank you, Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a pleasure. Joseph, it is always a pleasure to have you on the program. Your experience and length and breadth in public budgeting are in large measures unmatched. And I thank you for always agreeing to take part in the program. I know for sure we're better for the discussions that you have brought to bear. Richard, like yourself, your experience are always valuable, and thank you again for always be willing to come on the town hall and share your views. Ladies and gentlemen, that is our program for tonight. Thank you all for tuning in, and feel free to go back and to look at this program, take parts of it, ask questions, send us your comments, and share it widely so that all Guyanese can engage in this discussion and benefit from it. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all.
Thank you, gentlemen. Good evening.
Thank you.